Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this panel on the Coastal Zone Management Act's Federal Consistency Authority, 45 years of state-federal collaboration. My name is John Ryan Henry. I am Resilience Specialist and Legal Advisor at the Coastal States Organization, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to representing the nation's coastal states, territories, and commonwealths on ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes resources issues. I'm very pleased to have been invited to moderate this session as an opportunity for our members in the coastal programs and summit participants to learn more about the critical role that federal consistency plays in empowering state and territory coastal management programs to proactively and efficiently partner not just with federal agencies, but with coastal communities, industries, and stakeholders in the responsible management and protection of the coastal zone. Thank you very much to Elizabeth Ruther, Science and Policy Analyst at the Pew Charitable Trusts, who invited me to moderate today's panel and who organized the panel and all the wonderful panelists we have today. We will be hearing pre-recorded presentations from 4 panelists. First, David Kaiser with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management will set the stage with his presentation on why federal consistency is important and will provide some background on its operation within the Coastal Zone Management Act. Next, we'll hear from Jim Boyd with Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Management Council, who will discuss the development of CRMC's Ocean SAMP to manage offshore development and talk about its geographic location descriptions and enforceable policies. After that, Bettina Rayfield with Virginia's Department of Environmental Quality will share her program's experience in NOAA's program change process, developing a new set of narrative enforceable policies. And finally, Heather Wade with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development will provide some forward-looking insight on federal consistency's role within coastal management across the next 50 years. After the presentations, we will open for questions and discussions. So audience members, please prepare your questions for the panel as we go along.
Good afternoon. My name is David Kaiser, Senior Policy Analyst with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, talking to you briefly today about federal consistency and some of the broader issues about why it's important, what narrative enforceable policies are, and geographic location descriptions. And then our other speakers will talk about more specifics about some of these items. So I've been with the Office for Coastal Management since 1987, and I became the lead for federal consistency in 1991. I now lead the National Interest Team in our office, which oversees federal consistency, program changes, and a number of other CZMA-related issues. I located to the University of New Hampshire in 2005. So the importance of federal consistency. So we all know federal actions in or outside of the coastal zones, regardless of location, that have coastal effects must be consistent with the enforceable policies of state coastal management programs. NOAA's role in federal consistency we provide expert assistance on federal consistency compliance, interpreting the regulations. We provide trainings around the country for states and federal agencies and others, and we mediate disputes, mostly between federal agencies and states. Our office also approves the enforceable policies that states use for federal consistency, changes to state federal consistency lists that identify activities subject to federal consistency review. We review and approve geographic location descriptions proposed by states to review activities outside of the coastal zone, and we review and approve state requests to review unlisted activities both inside and outside the coastal zone. Now, federal consistency is a powerful tool for states. It's a primary incentive for state participation in the National Coastal Program because it gives states this unique review authority. And I emphasize unique review authority because there aren't many federal statutes that you can think of that give this level of review authority and meaningful input that states have into federal actions. It applies state enforceable policies to federal actions based on effects, not location. And of course, there are no categorical limitations to the application of federal consistency to federal actions. If a state objects to a federal license or permit activity, or an outer continental shelf plan for oil and gas or renewable energy, or to a federal financial assistance activity, the federal agency cannot authorize that activity unless the applicant appeals to the Secretary of Commerce and we override the state's objection. So while it is a powerful tool for the states, there are national interest considerations and national interest balance in the CZMA and the regulations. And one is that it is a review authority. So states can review these federal actions, but they don't have the authority to manage the actions, to redefine those actions, to regulate those federal actions. For federal agency activities, the effects are first determined by federal agencies on whether to provide a consistency determination to a state or not. If a state objects, a federal agency can proceed over the state's objection if it is consistent to the maximum extent practicable. And there is a presidential exemption available only for federal agency activities, although that's only been used once. For federal license or permit activities, the applicant can appeal the state's objection to the Secretary of Commerce, who can then override that state's objection. And those appeals have now been delegated from the Secretary of Commerce to NOAA. So turning to narrative enforceable policies. So what are enforceable policies, first of all, just so that we all have a common understanding? So these are the NOAA approved policies in a state's coastal management program. These have to be legally binding under state law. They can't just sort of be a policy statement located somewhere. They actually have to have some legal standing under state law. They contain a definable standard that someone has to comply with, but the policy doesn't have to be so specific that it provides a roadmap to compliance. And of course, enforceable policies are the basis for federal consistency reviews and state federal consistency decisions. Now, the legal location within a state's program and the types of enforceable policies vary state by state. So some enforceable policies are contained in state statutes, regulations, permit programs. Some states have some of their enforceable policies in local coastal programs or other legally enforceable formats under state law. States that have a large number of enforceable policies, both in statute and regulations or local programs, must continually submit to NOAA program changes to keep these enforceable policies up to date as those statutes and regulations are changed by state legislatures. Now, some states have always had a small set of enforceable policies that are generally described. They are effects-based so that they can apply to any type of federal action with those described effects in the policies. These are what we call narrative enforceable policies. One example is the state of California. California has a big program. They have local programs. There's many parts of the California coastal program, but the enforceable policies that they use for CZMA federal consistency reviews are a very small set of generally described policies contained within the California Coastal Act. And so there's never a need to bring those in as program changes because they don't get changed. And they can apply those broadly described policies to any federal action that comes down the pipe. So these narrative enforceable policies are based on state statutory or regulatory provisions, and as I said, are rarely changed, so states don't need to submit program changes to NOAA in most cases. Recently, some states have changed or are changing their enforceable policies to a smaller set of effects-based narrative policies to reduce program change submissions and other administrative burdens associated with continually updating state regulations, state statutes, and so on and so forth as part of enforceable policies. And this should make it easier for states, federal agencies, and others to identify the applicable enforceable policies for federal consistency reviews. Turning to geographic location descriptions. So geographic location descriptions, or GLDs, are described in NOAA's federal consistency regulations as a means to provide a reasonable process to review federal license or permit activities, subpart D of our regulations, and OCS, Outer Continental Shelf, plans for oil and gas activities, or in some cases, renewable energy activities on the OCS, which is subpart E of our regulations, outside of a state's coastal zone. So for example, either inland of the coastal zone or in federal waters. GLDs are not that relevant for federal agency activities because for federal agency activities, the agency has to provide a consistency determination if their activity will have coastal effects, regardless of where that activity occurs, with or without a GLD. If a state wants to add a GLD to its coastal management program, it works with NOAA within the Office for Coastal Management to develop a program change to determine what federal actions would be included within a specific geographic area outside the coastal zone by developing a coastal effects analysis. And that analysis has 8 parts to it, and those are described in our new program change regulations, which became final and published in the Federal Register in August of 2019. And so when a state wants to propose a GLD, it includes these following 8 items in their analysis. They describe what the affected uses are, or the affected resources, where those and in what densities those uses and resources are found. Very important, how the state has a specific interest in that resource or use, where the activity over the proposed activity that would be included in that GLD for review overlaps with these resources, uses, or values. Then describe what the impacts from the types of activities that a state wants to review in the GLD, describe what those impacts might be to coastal uses or resources, and then tying those impacts to coastal effects. What is showing a reasonable showing of a causal connection from the activity to coastal effects. And then looking at the types of activities, federal actions that a state wants to review in that GLD, and some discussion of the expected mitigation that might be required for those, why that mitigation might be inadequate to address the coastal effects. And then, of course, providing empirical data that supports the effects analysis. Now, this is just an example of a GLD. In fact, recent GLD interest is driven by offshore wind power projects, particularly in the Atlantic, but also possible oil and gas leasing as well. And this is just a Rhode Island example. So what you see here is state waters within the yellow border lines, and then this purple dotted line, that is the Rhode Island's first GLD that came about as a result of their Ocean Special Area Management Plan, and this was their study area for that plan, and so they used all the information and data from that ocean SAMP to support this GLD, which goes out about 30 miles here, to review a number of federal actions that would occur within that area. They now have another GLD that goes beyond this for offshore wind power projects. But again, this is just one example which Jim is going to talk about in more detail. And so this is just how you learn more about the program. That's our website. If you just Google NOAA and federal consistency, this will be the first thing that pops up. You'll find the statute and the regulations there, the preambles to our 2000 and 2006 regulations, which have a ton of information, as well as the new program change regs and other reference documents. And with that, I'll turn it over for questions when we get to those. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Boyd. I'm with the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council. I've been with the Council for 20 years, and my primary responsibilities are development of the Council's policies and regulations, development of special area management plans, conducting federal consistency reviews, and more recently, leading the CRMC's offshore wind review team. Today's presentation is focusing on the development of the CRMC's Ocean Special Area Management Plan, its enforceable policies, and the geographic location descriptions used for the federal consistency review of offshore wind energy projects. So to familiarize our audience today with our area of interest here in southern New England, this is a graphic representing the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's offshore renewable lease blocks here off the coasts of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. This area is approximately 1,400 acres in size and has been the subject of the most intense offshore renewable energy activity in the nation. To begin with, the CRMC initiated the development of the Ocean Special Area Management Plan when there was an initial proposal going back more than 10 years ago now for a very large offshore wind farm south of Block Island. And at that time, the Council determined that it would be necessary to develop a comprehensive plan to address the needs of the state of Rhode Island, to promote the renewable energy future, to address climate change impacts here in Rhode Island, but also at the same time to ensure the protection of existing coastal resources and uses of the state of Rhode Island. Particularly important was the commercial fishing industry, which is very important to the state of Rhode Island, and the intense interest for offshore renewable energy development within this area shown in the center graphic, which is the Ocean SAM planning boundary. One of the first things that we needed to do, and anyone would do in the development of an offshore ocean management plan, is to map resources of interest. And so through a marine spatial planning exercise, you can pull together existing data and map it, and also identify information gaps that you might have to help you recognize additional information that may be needed to develop policies and regulations important to your particular state. So in this case, we looked at, as an example here on the screen, is glacial moraine habitat, which is a proxy for important fish habitat. We also looked at important Department of Defense and navigation issues within the planning boundary, and other habitat of various species. In this case, it happened to be sea duck habitat, which would be areas of less than 20 meters, which represent important areas for foraging for sea ducks. And we also considered intense navigation traffic, and in this case, this map represents areas of commercial navigation as measured by the automated information system that's on any vessel of 65 feet or greater. So the brighter red areas represent very high areas of intensity of ship traffic. So all of this data together is helpful in establishing your priorities to develop your enforceable policies and to make the case for developing a geographic location description, as would have been explained by my colleague, David Kaiser, in the previous presentation. The other information that we wanted to consider was areas that are important for commercial fishing activity. In this graphic, we use the Northeast Ocean Data Portal, and here we're showing areas of high commercial fishing intensity represented by the yellow and orange, and then the darker orange colors here on this graphic. And then when overlaying with the BOEM lease blocks, you can see the intersection of areas of higher intensity of fishing effort in relation to the various lease blocks. So by going through this analysis, you can figure out where there could be potential conflicts between development proposals and existing coastal uses. Rhode Island developed two different geographic location descriptions. The first one in 2011, represented by the red dashed line here, the sort of reddish pinkish shaded area here. And then also a GLD in 2018, represented by the gray shaded area. In both those cases, the CRMC submitted significant information and a request to NOAA for a program change to approve of these two specific geographic location descriptions with specific listed activities. In the 2011 GLD, again, coincident with the ocean SAMP planning boundary, we had a list of a number of different federal activities and federal permits associated with that area. In the gray shaded area here, representing the 2018 GLD, the only activities listed are the installation of offshore wind turbines and submerged cables. All of those activities are listed in Table 2 of the CRMC's Federal Consistency Manual. So this sets up your review authority for specifically listed activities, provided they occur within either of those two GLDs. The other important part of the development of the CRMC's Ocean SAMP was the development of the enforceable policies pertaining to offshore development, including offshore wind. This was a process over a couple of years involving multiple stakeholders and public meetings to flesh out the important issues to stakeholders and the interests of Rhode Island. These are just a few examples of some of the enforceable policies that we implement along with other general policies for projects in state waters that the CRMC implements through the Ocean Special Area Management Plan. We apply these enforceable policies for federal consistency purposes when reviewing offshore wind development. So in this case, these policies require that an offshore development carefully consider the siting, the design, the operation, and the eventual decommissioning of a project, and to avoid any potential negative impacts to coastal uses or resources. In the case where some of those impacts may be unavoidable, then as required by the enforceable policies, the developer would have to provide mitigation. One of our enforceable policies, and then through the development of the Ocean SAMP, the CRMC established its Fishermen's Advisory Board. And the Fishermen's Advisory Board assists the CRMC in determining what types of impacts would occur to the commercial fishing industry and the fish processors. So we have representation on the Fishermen's Advisory Board, or we call the FAB, of commercial and recreational fishing interests, as well as shoreside processors. The FAB is strictly advisory to the CRMC and has no regulatory authority, but they are an integral element when it comes to assisting the CRMC in determining potential impacts, and when those impacts are unavoidable, the developer is required by the enforceable policy to engage with the CRMC and the FAB to come up with a suitable mitigation agreement. In the case of the Vineyard Wind Project, which the CMP found concurrence with back in early 2019, the developer proposed a mitigation plan that was negotiated between the CRMC and the Fishermen's Advisory Board as required by the enforceable policies. In this case, it resulted in some direct compensation to Rhode Island fishermen, along with the development of a trust fund to be used by the fishermen in perhaps educational aspects, changing out gear on the boats so that they would have better radar or better methods to enable them to fish more efficiently within a wind farm configuration, for example. And lastly, this is an example here of the current state procurements in the Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area here circled as shown. And as you can see, at the present time, there are procurements of over 4 gigawatts in the southern New England waters for offshore wind. So there's a tremendous interest. It will result in eventually a build out of these particular projects of anywhere from 346 to 519 offshore wind turbines. And ultimately, over the course of the next decade, if this circled area is fully developed and developed in accordance with the Coast Guard's recommendation for this area of a 1-by-1 nautical mile grid pattern, the potential build out in the future could be as many as 960 wind turbines in this 1,400 square mile. And it will be one of the largest aggregation of wind turbines in the world at some point in the future. So with that, I will end my brief presentation and look forward to your questions in the question and answers section. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon. My name is Bettina Rayfield, and I'm the manager of the Office of Environmental Impact Review and Long Range Priorities at the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I will be discussing Virginia's experience developing narrative enforceable policies and NOAA's program change process. The Office of Environmental Impact Review is responsible for coordinating Virginia's response to several types of environmental planning documents and Virginia's federal consistency reviews as part of Virginia's NOAA-approved Coastal Zone Management Program. My work also focuses on addressing DEQ's adaptation strategies to address future climate conditions. Prior to joining the EIR program, I represented DEQ as the state chair on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Interagency Review Team, specializing in stream and wetland restoration and mitigation policy. Virginia's Coastal Zone Management Program was originally approved in 1986. It's a networked program. DEQ is the lead, but other state agencies administer some of the enforceable policies. These enforceable policies are the basis on which we determine if federal consistency projects are consistent with our program or if we must object. Currently, we have 9 enforceable policies. Well, actually, Virginia's current enforceable policies are select sections of state code and regulations approved by NOAA at the program's inception. It takes 51 of these pages just to list our current policies. The result of so many policies is that project proponents and state reviewers may not fully understand the Commonwealth's expectations for federal consistency projects. Recently, Virginia submitted a program change request to address changes to statutory and regulatory citations. NOAA did not approve this request since many of those laws and regulations did not meet the current criteria for an enforceable policy. Because of this, NOAA recommended that we develop narrative policies. Narrative policies will use plain language to clearly set out the standard for each policy. They will also reduce the need for routine program change requests, since even if a citation changes, the policy will not. There are three important aspects of an enforceable policy. They must contain a standard by which an activity can be determined to be consistent. There must be an enforceable mechanism based on state law or regulation to apply the standard, i.e., means to compel someone to do something or to not do something. And lastly, the policy must be approved by NOAA as an enforceable policy. Generally, the program change development went through 4 phases. Virginia utilized NOAA grant funding to support the development of narrative enforceable policies. We contracted the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at the William and Mary Law School to support and guide this work. This support was essential since DEQ does not have internal legal counsel, and we had only intermittent support from our Attorney General's office. We asked NOAA's Office for Coastal Management to attend the discussions, and their support was invaluable. We also involved the Department of the Navy for a federal agency perspective. During our development process, we met with each agency that administers our enforceable policies. We systematically went through all of the laws and regulations as we developed new narrative enforceable policies. We identified the standards and the supporting enforceable mechanism for each policy. We went through several iterations and reviewed each with our coastal policy team, which includes state agencies and local planning district officials. As we were getting close to the final submittal, NOAA notified us that they would be releasing new program change regulations and would be debuting their new program change portal. We held our submittal until this new guidance was released. NOAA's new portal was fairly easy to use. I'll talk about the portal itself in a moment. There were 5 documents that were included in our submittal: a cover letter, an analysis of changes, a draft public notice, the state CZM request table, and the actual narrative policies document. NOAA's regulations require that the draft program change be available for public comment for 21 days. Coordination with NOAA on the timing is critical. NOAA will post a public notice, which will contain a link to the state's website. The state will want the public notice available as soon as the public comment period is open. Virginia will also we also posted the public notice on our state's regulatory town hall and sent it out to our listserv recipients. In addition to the public notice posting, the program change regulations require that the notice be sent to several federal agencies. Public comments were submitted to NOAA through the portal. We received 5. NOAA asked us to address each of the public comments. Through this process, we identified several errors, clerical errors, and provided justification for certain proposed enforceable policies. Comments included questions regarding the nature of the program change, the enforceable mechanism for new policies, particularly for taking of T&E species, and the need for inclusion of newly passed legislation. Virginia provided a response to each comment to NOAA for their consideration. Finally, NOAA completes their internal review and hopefully will approve all of our proposed narrative enforceable policies. I have a question mark here because at the time of this recording, we are still awaiting NOAA's decision. A little on NOAA's program change portal. The state should identify a designated official and they request access to the portal. NOAA will give them login information. NOAA has also uploaded documents from previous submittals for each state to the portal. This information is available to the public without the need for login credentials. Once a new program change request is started, the designated official must complete the program change request form in the portal and upload supporting documents. Once the state hits the submit button, however, the state cannot make any changes to the portal, so you want to ensure that it is complete before that. During the drafting of the request, Virginia prepared the answers to the portal questions in a Word document until we were satisfied that we were ready to upload. NOAA also offered to review our draft submittal prior to its submission to ensure it was complete. We simply filled out the form in the portal, uploaded the supporting documents, and informed them it was available for their review, all before hitting that submit button. There are questions in the portal to identify the type of program change, whether it is for changes to the listed activities, the enforceable policies, a geographic location description, or the necessary data or information. When the state submits the program change request and NOAA determines that it is complete and ready for public notice, the submittal will be designated as under review and can be seen by the public. Prior to this program change, we had 9 general enforceable policy categories. We have revised them to these 12 general policy categories. The majority of the policies are restatements in narrative form of existing policies. Additionally, the program change request includes the incorporation of new enforceable policies addressing threatened and endangered species and nuisance and noxious species. Our new policies are only 26 pages long, nearly half the length of our old policies. With this program change, we will go from a long list of statutes and regulations to this, a policy that clearly describes what the standard is. This way, federal agencies and project proponents should be able to tell if the project is consistent with the policy, and the agency that administers it should be easily able to determine if it's consistent or if they must object. I have to give a special thanks to Carrie Kehoe and John Kiriawa with NOAA OCM for their support during this process, and to Elizabeth Andrews and Angela King from William & Mary's Virginia Coastal Policy Center for their leadership and organization. Thank you very much.
Howdy, my name is Heather Wade, and I am a Senior Coastal Policy Specialist with the Oregon Coastal Management Program and a PhD student at Texas A&M University. My talk today is going to center around the connections and opportunities between coastal management, federal consistency, and state and local regulations. Specifically, my research focuses on the extent and effectiveness of federal consistency as a tool for enhancing coastal resilience to climate change and coastal hazards. This talk will explore the inclusion of federal consistency as an important addition to the planning tool portfolio to enhance and increase coastal community resilience under rapidly changing conditions. So first, why are we talking about shared governance in the context of implementing federal consistency under the CZMA? My research focuses on the hypothesis that shared governance structures and features influence the effectiveness of CMP implementation, particularly as it relates to implementing a state's enforceable policies. This is especially important in the context of hazard mitigation, natural resource protection, and climate adaptation over the next 50 years and century. My research uses a shared governance theoretical framework as described in the land use planning literature to explore this hypothesis. How coastal management programs are structured matters because it impacts not only general program implementation, but the implementation of a CMP's enforceable policy framework and other state coastal authorities. While the CZMA itself provides a voluntary shared governance program, today we're going to focus on state structure and incorporation of local programs and policies. State CMP structures and enforceable policy frameworks vary widely due to the CZMA providing incredible flexibility for states to develop programs that suit the needs of their specific coastlines and conditions. Only a handful of states utilize local policies as part of their state enforceable policy framework. Additionally, some states utilize local coastal programs to delegate certain coastal authorities for local level issues, but do not incorporate them as part of the state federal consistency framework and process. We are exploring how these different aspects of shared governance influence policy implementation. There are different features of shared governance. Much research divides shared governance typologies into coercive versus cooperative. Many CMPs utilize a mixture of these types. Additionally, the literature shows that structural and facilitative features of shared governance have influence on the quality of plans and policies, as well as their implementation via development management strategies. Structural features include intergovernmental complexity, the authority to coerce, the clarity and importance of goals established for the program. Facilitative features of shared governance include program inclusion of local capacity building, local commitment building, implementation style, and implementation effort. These two categories of features are most often recognized through mandated programs. The effective implementation of a shared governance program is also dependent on the presence or not of state mandates, institutional structure, approaches to management, state agency capacity, and program activities and priorities. Our research shows that the inclusion of lower level governments in coastal management vary widely, and there are widely different examples of the incorporation of local authorities into CMPs. Examples of the types of local authorities incorporated into state programs include marsh protection plans, bay plans, local coastal programs, county ordinances and codes, district master plans, local waterfront revitalization plans, land use regulations and comprehensive plans, county conservation districts, and coastal zone steering committees. That list is not exhaustive. It's important to note that these examples include other coastal authorities outside of CMP's federal consistency review. In addition, program implementation outside of federal consistency review is not comprehensively discussed here or in my research. Here is a visual representation of the state coastal programs that have some type of local component to their programs. As you can see, less than half of CMPs utilize this approach. This research is ongoing and still in need of verification from state programs. I wanted to briefly go over some examples of shared governance and local components of CMPs. My 4 examples include California, New York, North Carolina, and Oregon. In California, 73 cities and counties are required to draft local coastal programs under the California CMP. Local coastal programs are required to be consistent with the California Coastal Act. Once approved, these LCPs gain authority to approve all development in coastal areas, but this is not involved with federal consistency. Permits within tidal and submerged lands, however, supersede local plans and policies and are left to the state to review and approve. The California Coastal Commission purposefully limits the scope of federal consistency review and leaves issues of local concern to local authorities. The New York Coastal Program has 44 state policies that are used for federal consistency purposes. In addition, the state offers local governments the opportunity to participate in the coastal program on a voluntary basis by preparing and adopting local waterfront revitalization plans. These provide more detailed implementation of the state CMP through use of such existing powers like zoning and site plan review. Approved plans are used to ensure both state and federal actions are consistent with state incorporated local policies. North Carolina's Coastal Area Management Act requires the state's 20 coastal counties to adopt local land use plans that comply with plan guidance developed by the Coastal Resources Commission. The plan guidance sets the format of the plan, what issues have to be addressed, and the planning process to be followed. Specific policies of each plan will be unique to the respective local government. All plans are required to address growth, protection of productive resources, economic development, natural resource protection, and hazard reduction. Approved local land use plans are used in the decision-making process for both coastal permits and federal consistency determinations. The program website states that proposed projects and activities must be consistent with the policies of a local land use plan, or DCM cannot permit a project to go forward. In Oregon, proposed projects must be consistent with enforceable policies contained within 3 program components: statewide planning goals, specific state agency authorities, and applicable acknowledged local comprehensive plans and land use regulations. Examples of state agency authorities include the Oregon Territorial Sea Plan, the Removal Fill Law, Water Quality Standards, and the Oregon Beach Bill. The OCMP is a highly networked program with dozens of state agencies, dozens of counties, and 33 local jurisdictions networked into the program. So, opportunities for addressing climate change and coastal resilience. Why the heck does federal consistency and shared governance matter? Well, data show that losses from and frequency of disasters are on the rise, especially in coastal areas. Local planning and hazard mitigation policies and tools can be used to minimize risks and losses. So I'm proposing that Federal Consistency Authority be added to this planning and development management tools portfolio for proper land and water use in the coastal zone. While local policies and plans can't necessarily stop federal permits from being issued, a state that incorporates local policies as state enforceable policies can. So for example, coastal wetland alteration under Section 404 permitting of the Clean Water Act, which is also an indicator of development, can be heavily influenced through the federal consistency process, giving the state and local governments the ability to weigh in on federal removal fill review processes. And this diagram that I'm showing is a really great example of the jurisdiction of the Army Corps. And so, for example, within a coastal wetland, if a local policy is incorporated as a state enforceable policy, those specific locally relevant policies can be used to make sure that they're complied with when a federal permit may or may not be issued. So there are many physical and economic vulnerabilities in the coastal zone. Examples of physical vulnerabilities include storm surge, hurricanes, coastal flooding, drought, subsidence, sea level rise, and erosion. Economic vulnerabilities include the reliance on ports and shipping, energy production, coastal fisheries, tourism, and agriculture. Additional impacts from climate change that are important to the coastal zone include saltwater intrusion, flooding of wetlands and marshes, changes in water availability and quality, changes to habitat and species distribution, lower oxygen levels in wetlands, ocean acidification, and more severe coastal storms and associated disasters. For an additional visual, here are sea level rise scenarios for the Gulf of Mexico. This first image is of mean high water. Next here, we see 1 foot of sea level rise, then 3 feet, and then 6 feet. Proper land use and environmental protection measures can aid in minimizing the impacts of sea level rise and associated flooding, while protecting and providing benefits to communities and the ecosystems they depend on. So very little empirical analysis has been done on federal consistency under the CZMA, and virtually no empirical studies exist regarding CMP enforceable policies. However, planning research provides evidence that based on some CMP structures and reliance on planning as a method for coastal management, federal consistency can be used for hazard mitigation and climate adaptation purposes, and may very well be a critical process over the next century. Hazard mitigation mostly takes place at the local level, and states that employ local policies within their federal consistency frameworks have the ability to incorporate locally specific policies that exceed state standards for more effective hazard mitigation and natural resource protection. While these are potential actions for improvements to CMPs nationwide, it is important to note that coordination among all levels of government is critical to successfully implementing this approach. So what can CMPs do to adapt via coastal policy? They can develop and implement adaptation plans linked to maintaining water quality of marshes and wetlands, protecting coastal development, preserving habitat, or controlling invasive species. For example, with wetlands, prohibiting construction of bulkheads, establishing rolling easements, or incorporating wetland protection into the planning of new infrastructure are examples of things you could put in policies. For maintaining sediment transport, you could create policies that prioritize and incentivize beach nourishment, remove barriers to sediment deposition on wetlands, for example, levees. And these types of policies could potentially be incorporated into coastal management programs as enforceable policies. Of course, by ensuring policies that meet criteria as defined by NOAA. So, looking forward to the next 50 years and beyond, there is much opportunity for states to effectively mitigate hazards and adapt to climate change impacts via plans and policies. States can implement locally specific policies via federal consistency, but will require greater coordination with all levels of government and careful attention to the shared governance structures for program implementation. It is critical that we remember that coastal conditions are changing fast, and these changes will continue faster as time goes on. So whether or not state CMPs utilize local policies, hazard mitigation will continue to take place most effectively at the local level, and finding ways to incorporate this into the coastal planning toolbox and coastal management strategies will be imperative. So thank you very much for listening to my talk today. My contact information and social media handles are listed here. I'm happy to discuss further with you, so please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm looking forward to any questions you may have.
All right. Well, as our panelists bring up their webcams, let's get ready to get started on the question and answer session for this panel during our first round of concurrent sessions. I'm glad to have Bettina, David, Heather, and Jim all online now. You can see folks' webcams. Bettina's also on the line by phone. So we've had a couple questions already coming in as the presentations went on. Please feel free, members of the audience, to go ahead and type those questions in to the chat box, and I'll be able to see them on my control panel on this end.
The audio started coming
to the panelists to respond. Say again?
That's good data.
I think we have some background noise coming through. So let me just get the conversation started. We're celebrating 50-year anniversaries for NOAA CSO this year, and the 50th anniversary of the CZMA itself is coming up in a couple years as well. When the Coastal Zone Management Act was promulgated back in 1972, it really was a trailblazing model for governance based on cooperation between states, federal agencies, coastal communities, and coastal users, both project proponents and stakeholders in the wise use of coastal resources. And federal consistency that we're talking about here today is really the cornerstone of that engagement model. It allows preemptive and proactive engagement with all the relevant players around the table early on in the development of individual projects. And as a lot of the presentations we heard today reflect, it also plays an important role at the programmatic planning and engagement level in the development of coastal and ocean plans and enforceable policies, bringing all the relevant folks to the table through that process. So just to get the ball rolling on the conversation, now that we're almost 50 years in, I'd like to hear from all the folks here that are from coastal programs in states, as well as from David on behalf of NOAA and the federal government, to comment a little on the benefits and the role that federal consistency has played in your states to achieve sound and effective coastal management goals.
Well, John, since you've thrown out the question, I'll try to be the first to respond here. the CRMC has effectively been using federal consistency authority now for more than a couple decades. And, I would say for me personally, and I think the program's great interest has been the application of federal consistency with this emerging development of offshore wind. I think many listeners, participants here will know that Rhode Island was able to develop the first offshore wind farm in the nation, the Block Island Wind Farm, which is a 5-turbine, essentially a demonstration project, if you will. And that really was the result of the CRMC's Ocean Special Area Management Plan and the standards and enforceable policies that were developed through that Ocean Special Area Management Plan. I would venture to say that because of federal consistency, the CRMC has had a major influence on the direction that at least the development of offshore wind in southern New England waters goes, is taking a direction that the wind farm layout and spacing has been advocated by the CRMC as favored by commercial fishing interests primarily. And it's really a direct result of the first commercial size offshore wind farm that BOEM started reviewing, the Vineyard Wind Farm project, really is bearing out now as to what's happening on an industry-wide scale. And federal consistency has played and will continue to play a very important role in that discussion, certainly for southern New England waters.
I know, Bettina, you're also looking at wind development, but within or beyond wind development, any thoughts from other panelists?
Well, as David mentioned, federal consistency gives the states the ability to review federal projects that we may not have any influence over, and that is a huge benefit for the state. We've definitely been able to influence some projects to make them consistent with our program just through the review and with discussions with the federal agencies. And then the review of federal licenses and permits, we've definitely been able to improve projects to reduce their coastal impacts.
Any other thoughts?
Sure. One of the things I think is a major benefit of federal consistency is the coordination and collaboration aspect. I feel like we don't really emphasize that enough. A lot of times it's not just about concurring or objecting to a project. The Federal Consistency Authority has given the Oregon program increased and improved coordination, and that is with all levels of government. And so I really try to emphasize that when we do our outreach and engagement. The other thing is that when we are doing a review, it's not just about reviewing compliance with policies and evaluating coastal effects, but really coordinating with applicants and federal agencies to figure out how they can become consistent with state policies. And I think that that is really unique.
It's helpful because it's an early engagement process, so that the proponent hasn't locked in their decisions and is able to find the changes that could bring that consistency. Any other final thoughts before the next question?
Yeah, this is David. I would just add that, the collaboration is really important, and the early coordination collaboration, even if it's not project or agency specific. We've seen it through the trainings that we do. A lot of those educational aspects that we've done over the years continue to be helpful for the states and federal agencies to work together, develop relationships. And of course, what goes around comes around. Just when we think we've resolved everything, there's staff turnover, there's new issues that come up, there's novel ways that states and federal agencies think about using federal consistency, and so we have to continue that education, that outreach, that collaboration. It's certainly not a one-time thing.
Yeah, and I would add to what David just said, that in fact, the federal consistency rules under 15 CFR Part 930 really encourages early coordination between the federal agencies and the CZM programs, as well as proponents that are seeking federal licenses and permits. It's encouraged in the federal regulations, and we really need to take advantage of that whenever we can.
And just when I think I've got the regulations perfect, you guys come up with something new.
Got to keep you on your toes. All right, we have a follow-up question for Bettina. Did Virginia's coastal management program leverage Section 309 funds in the development of the narrative enforceable policies?
So yes, we used that funding to contract with the William & Mary Virginia Coastal Policy Center to lead the development of the narrative policies.
Thank you. We have another question here. This is in response to Heather's presentation, but I think others might also have input on it. Are there successful examples of states that have incorporated climate adaptation and resilience criteria into enforceable policies as part of their coastal management programs?
Well, I would say that we're certainly starting to see states develop those as part of their either their 309 programs or just program changes in general. I know the San Francisco Bay Conservation Development Commission is certainly working on those and has some adaptation policies. And we've been working with, I think, several states to try and address that in a way that they can be approved as enforceable policies.
Yeah, and I would just add to what David said that Rhode Island, for example, in our coastal program, we have climate change policies and some standards in place. And we actually developed through another special area management plan called the Shoreline Change SAMP or the Beach SAMP. We developed a whole guidance document for folks, and then developed tools to help them, and implemented a regulatory change in the Red Book to require that for projects that meet certain thresholds, to go through an analysis to look at potential climate change impacts to projects over the period of time for which the project is designed. So for example, if you're building a bridge or some other large infrastructure that you expect to last for 50 years, we require you to look at potential climate change impacts over that 50-year period and design accordingly so that you can be resilient to those changes in the coming decades with climate change.
The Beach SAMP is a great example of the coastal program working within its regulatory authority and then also working through its technical assistance and support to local communities as well. We have a question here for our panelists from the state programs. What challenges do you face with changes in administrations at the state level in your day-to-day work with federal consistency?
Oh, that's a good question. Fortunately, we've had strong leadership both at the governor and in the legislature in terms of the Rhode Island Coastal Program. It's been well supported, and federal consistency again has been a part of the Rhode Island Coastal Program for more than 2 decades now, and we're using it now in particular with offshore wind. The Ocean Special Area Management Plan was developed really to look at coastal uses and coastal resources, not only in Rhode Island's coastal zone, but also in the federal waters. And the Ocean SAMP encourages the coexistence of existing uses and resources along with new offshore developments, and that includes the renewable energy industry. We all know that we have to move to a renewable energy future and decarbonize our energy base and the way we conduct our daily life. So we are really promoting this move to renewable energy, using federal consistency to ensure that this new emerging industry is going to coexist with existing uses out there, in particular commercial fishing, because commercial fishing is important in feeding the nation and the world. And as one commercial fisherman has said more than once to us, you can't eat electricity.
Very true. Any thoughts, Bettina or Heather?
Well, I've only been in this program for 5 years, and so we've had one change in state government at the executive branch level, and both were Democrats. And so both have been very supportive of our program, and the current governor is very supportive of offshore wind development and coastal protection. And our Secretary of Natural Resources is very familiar with the Coastal Zone Management Program, which is very helpful. And they've just always been supportive, but as an executive branch agency, we always represent the governor's policies, and so that can definitely influence the reviews.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I would just add, again, back to the question about local government, our governor, Gina Raimondo, has been a very, very strong proponent of offshore wind and renewable energy in general. And in fact, in 2017, she moved the dial for Rhode Island and by executive order established the fact that Rhode Island would meet 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy by the end of this year. And we will meet that goal with everything that's existing now and in the pipeline. In addition, earlier this year in January, she issued an executive order that states that by 2030, Rhode Island will obtain 100% of its electric load needs from renewable energy. The only way we're going to be able to do that is through energy obtained through the offshore wind industry. That is the largest potential out there right now to provide the kind of base load needed along the Atlantic coast and certainly in New England.
So we'll be coming up on time shortly. Have time to quickly touch on one more question to Bettina. How long did it take to develop the narrative policies? And are there any major learning outcomes you would want to share with other programs thinking about diving into the narrative policy planning?
It took us quite a while just through the funding process. Did it on the cycles of the 309 funding, and so it took us about 4 years or more than that, actually a little more than that. And we're not done yet. We're expecting a response from NOAA soon. And I think coordination with NOAA is essential. They're the ones that are going to be able to tell you the, a national perspective of what other states are doing and what they've approved in other states and why they've not approved certain policies. We're a network program, like I mentioned, and so we had to coordinate with each agency to go through their laws and regs, and we hadn't made a program change to our policies in quite a long time, nothing so vast. So it did take us a long time, but I just the coordination with NOAA and then the coordination with a federal agency is very important.
I would agree with that indeed. And in contrast, the Rhode Island Coastal Program has direct permitting authority. We are not a network program, and David would know best here, but I believe Rhode Island is one of 3 coastal programs in the nation that have direct permitting authority. And, you know, in terms of the question about the development of enforceable policies and approval through NOAA, if I remember correctly, when Rhode Island submitted its program change request for our 2018 GLD, I believe we might have been the first coastal program in the nation to submit through the new program change portal. And NOAA staff was extremely helpful in guiding us through that process when we submitted our 2018 program change for the GLD that is now effective. So NOAA program staff, like David in particular, were extremely valuable in helping us in that endeavor.
Yeah, and I would just share, in Oregon, we don't have narrative policies, but it is something that we are looking into. We are a highly networked program with both state and local level policies, which end up being like thousands of policies. And so it does take a lot of upkeep. And so we are exploring narrative policies as a way to make it a little easier for us.
I think you're muted there, John.
I sure am. I was saying we're just coming up on time. So thank you very much to each of you on the panel. Thank you to Liz for coordinating this. Thank you very much to all of our attendees for coming out and joining us at the summit. We've got a lot more great programming coming up. And on behalf of CSO, we're very glad to have this platform to help the national community of practice of coastal management come together and be able to share lessons like on this panel. So please continue to reach out to all of us to learn more and keep sharing information. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.